You're right. I think the last time I had written and published short stories was 2001 in the United States. L'Ange sur le Toit came out here a year or two after that. So it had been a while, and I think, and I finished the last novel before that. It was Lost Memory of Skin, which was a difficult book to write. It was difficult material to work with, and it took 3 years, and I think I felt sort of a little bit brain dead. I felt exhausted, and writing stories really taps a different part of one's brain. Different mentality is employed in writing short stories than writing novels, and I think I turned to it just for relief in a way, and to replenish my stores, my resources for fiction, for novel writing. Because really writing short stories is a little bit more like writing poetry, or doing mathematics or music. It's a in a sense more artificial form. It's one that the form you can be conscious of from beginning to end in a way that is very difficult with a novel. It's in a sense, I suppose, somehow less organic in that by the time you get to the end of a short story, you can still remember the beginning, so you can hold the whole thing in your mind at once, which you can't do with a novel. A novel makes that impossible. From about page 75, you start forgetting the beginning, and whereas not the case with short stories. So there was that, and the truth of the matter is that I actually really love the form, and love reading them, and love writing them, short stories, and I wanted to return. I wanted to return to the form again after a long while away. So it was like returning to an old lover, Why don't the French have enthusiastic appreciation for the story? Well, to my astonishment, they actually received this book very, very well, and I was delighted, of course. But I didn't expect it, because you're right. The French have shown less enthusiasm for the form of the French writers, and presumably French readers. But yet, French are masters of the short story in the 19th century. Certainly de Maupassant is one of the greatest short story writers in literary history. A writer who certainly had an impact on me and on most American, Canadian, and Irish short story writers. But it's an interesting question, because I know that the Americans certainly, and the Canadians and the Irish have a long and distinguished association with the short story, affection for the short story, and an ability to write them. Whereas the French seem to have lost interest somewhere, maybe in the early 20th century. Colette, there were a few writers like that who practiced the short story, but it hasn't had the same popularity. It's hard to know. I think a tradition, I can't speak really about France's literary imagination with much authority, but a tradition rises and holds the imagination of a people when there are a sufficient number of masters of that form that appear. In the 20th century, the United States and Canada and Ireland have produced masters of the short story. The English also, to some degree. D.H. Lawrence wrote some great short stories. Catherine Mansfield, well, she's really, I think, from New Zealand. But from the ex-British colonies, in a way, produced great short stories in the 20th century. The Canadians in the form Alice Munro, Mavis Gallant. But what I'm trying to get to, I think, is that when you have 3, 4, 5 masters, then for generations writers will enthusiastically imitate those masters in that form, whatever form they work in. We had Hemingway in the 20th century, but before that we had Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, etc., were masters of the form. And then in the 20th century it continued on from the 1920s through the 1950s with writers like Ernest Hemingway and Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, John Cheever, John Updike, and all the way up to the present, Raymond Carver, etc. And so I think that helps to create both an audience of readers who care passionately about the form, and also another generation of writers to follow along behind. And maybe if France had had a Hemingway in the early 20th century, or a Eudora Welty rising up, then maybe there would be young writers today wouldn't be trying to write short stories as good as those. Began as a poet in my early 20s. I wrote poetry and I published some small books of poetry, and I still do come back to it every now and then, but I don't publish it anymore. Actually, I'm married to a very fine poet, Chase Twitchell is her name, and she has published widely and is very well known in the United States and in England. And so having a very fine poet at home who's better than I will ever be it can be a little intimidating, and so I never really published my work as a poet. But there is a side of my mind that has an affection for both poetic forms and the short form, the prose form of story, and I enjoy returning to it all the time. You know, each form does a different thing. It has a different function in a way. It has different access to the human heart. And one year I wrote the 12 stories pretty much, not in the same order that they're in. I reshuffled the order when I had the stories. But yeah, I sat down and went through my notebooks, and I keep a file of clippings and ideas and things that attract me that might someday be a good story, and I pulled out the 12 that I wanted to work with that seemed intriguing enough for me to want to develop into a story. Notes, some cases it was just a line or two, a note, an idea, a suggestion. Other cases it was a whole newspaper clipping with a whole story that I thought that would be a really good story if made into fiction, and so on. So they all came together, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. That's one of the things I love about it, is that you can become very intimate with an interior moment that shows and dramatizes a change in someone's perceptions of themselves, perhaps, or a perception of their past, perception of their some moment of emotional change and access that they might not have had in the past. And it's very intimate. It's right up close and very subjective, and maybe on the exterior nothing has changed. You know, there's no behavioral change, perhaps, but interiorized there is something going on, and it's dramatic. It's felt as dramatic, at least. And I love that about the short story, because you can't quite get that intimate in a novel. At least you can't sustain that kind of intimacy. Well, it's meant to be ironic, right? Yeah. No, I was trying to get to. I realized when I finished the stories, I didn't title them ahead of time. I mean, some of the stories I did, but I didn't title the book until I was finished. And I looked through and I saw the title of that one story about the man, the divorcee, with his dogs and his dog and his children, trying to make some kind of peace with the disruption of a divorce. I realized that title was good for almost all of them, because it pointed toward, and most of the stories in one way or the other point to the profound necessity of family to all of us in an age when the notion of family, the very notion of family, is changing so rapidly and so significantly. There was that profound need for family on the one hand, and then there was the inescapable and obvious fragility of family on the other. And so I realized that was a kind of inherent conflict throughout the book in many ways, and that it was therefore a good title. But I also knew that, as in the short story itself, it's with that title, it was meant to be seen as ironic and this. That's an interesting notion. I hadn't thought of that actually at the time, and I think that one can see that. Yes, that they do. The structure of the book overall, in some ways, does reflect the discontinuity, maybe, in lives, and that people are trying. The characters are trying, in many ways, to create a story of their own life that has continuity, and it doesn't. So much of the people's lives are made up of these discrete moments, that are quite distinct from each other. And part of the problem and the difficulty of life is putting them together in a coherent way, so that they make sense. So I think it maybe can be said to reflect that. I didn't intend it, but certainly one can see that.
Words like snowbirds.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That and dogs are here and
I have
there.
A question about
they
that.
Keep coming up again and again.
Yeah.
But and of course, since I wrote them all fairly close to each other, they reflect my obsessions or concerns or anxieties of the moment, and of a very similar, or even in some cases nearly the same moment. So they have to have those kinds of linkages underneath the surface, holding them together. Yeah, this is true. And location too. I mean, they either are up north in upstate New York, way up near the borders, or else they're down in South Florida, and that reflects my life, the bipolarity of my life, which goes from upstate New York during this era of my life to southern Florida as well. So. Yeah, I think so. In a way, the small towns of the upstate New York stories are America of the past. The industries have left, and the people are struggling economically, and the towns have been abandoned to some degree. Many social institutions of the past have collapsed, but the towns persist, and it's in a way, it's the America of the voters for Donald Trump. And then Miami, South Florida, is the America of the future. It's multiracial, multicultural, bilingual. I mean, that's the future of America, for better or worse. And the American past and the American future, or the fantasy about the past and the dream of the future, are in a way in profound conflict today in America. So, in a sense, the stories really reflect that. A story like Blue, for instance, which is set in Miami, a black woman who's dealing with racism and dealing with the violence of the community that surrounds her and so forth. You couldn't tell that story very well if you tried to put it up north in that small town, and where so many of the other stories take place, and vice versa. Some of the stories that take place in upstate New York couldn't be told or couldn't be set in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, I usually have the reader in mind. I mean, at least toward the end. I mean, when I get to the process of revision and rewriting and so on, I begin to then think more and more consciously of the reader. I don't think about the reader very consciously in the early stages. I'm really thinking about myself. I'm writing for myself here. What do I think is true and necessary? But as you go, you slowly convert yourself into a reader, and then you align yourself with the reader in a sense. So Yeah, I was aware of it, and shaping the stories with that in mind, I think. And here's something that is unusual for me about the book, because I've published other books of stories, which, as you suggested, were taken from a longer period of time. There might be 3 stories written 5 years ago, and 2 stories written last year, and 5 stories written 10 years ago, and so on. In this case, that wasn't so, and I think, without making too big a deal out of it, I imagined this book being read from beginning to end the way one would read a novel. And not selectively, not dip in here and one night read one story and then a month later read another story from someplace else in the book. And so I think I was aware of that movement through in a way that's closer to how a novel is read. Usually I don't write about artists, writers, or painters, or artists. Yeah, it's a bit of a cliche, and in some ways, I suppose that have tried to avoid writing about artists. But I was really writing about the male ego in a way, and vanity, male vanity, and pride, and how fragile it is and delicate it is. And I thought, well, if the biggest possible award came, it could have been. He didn't have to be an artist, but that's when I happen to know the details of that and how it works, and I've known a few people who have won the MacArthur, and I've known a few people who have won major prizes of that sort, even Nobel, and it does change you in unexpected ways, and it exploits that kind of attention. And award can exploit your weaknesses, whatever they may be. If you have a weakness for alcohol or drugs, you may end up spending the money on alcohol and drugs. If you have if your weakness is vanity or pride, you may end up finding it bringing you to your knees or ruining your life. And so anyhow, I wanted to experiment with that. And what if a nice but fairly ordinary avant-garde artist who had been given some attention in his career, but basically overlooked, suddenly got this high visibility award. How would that affect him? And you always kind of begin a story like this with a question, with a mystery of some sort, and that was the mystery I was trying to explore. Take this rather decent and nice man who had a high opinion of himself, but one that wasn't shared necessarily with the rest of the world. How would he react if all of a sudden the rest of the world embraced him? And so I have many friends who have won the MacArthurs, and not many, but some, who quickly asked me if this isn't about me, is it? And I said, "Oh no, of course not. It has nothing to do with you whatsoever." Wholly fictional character, yes.
Of course.
Yeah, I think so. Or another way to put it too was, which you started to point to, and it's most vivid, I think, in that story, is the human heart in conflict with itself.
Yeah.
There's a story about a man meeting a woman in a hotel at a convention whom he had met many years earlier, and had almost had a love affair with, and then had stepped away from it. And that's a case of a man whose heart is in conflict with itself. And most of the stories can be seen, I think, in one form or the other, where they want one thing but they do another, or they don't want to do something but they do it anyhow, and so on. And that is something that I think touches all fiction writers, all storytellers. We sense that, and we go toward that to try to dramatize that in some way or other. That particular story, Transplant in English, that was a particularly useful metaphor, the literal heart transplant, and the man in the beginning is a cold man, a man who seems not to have a heart, and in a figurative sense, and the transplant and the widow of the man whose heart has been transplanted. In that story, it isn't until this woman whose plight, whose loss is much greater than his, comes to him, and because he has her husband's heart in his body, he's somehow able to feel her pain and suffering and loss, and it breaks him. I mean, it opens his heart, I should say, in a way that is new. I actually really like that little story. It's very short, but I'm fond of it partly because the metaphor of the transplanted heart is such a rich one. Yes, I think you see it in all kinds of ways. I mean, maybe most immediately the first story, former Marine, where his perception of his world is that of a man who became a Marine in when he was a boy, and he did everything he was supposed to do. He took care of his sons. He got them educated. He worked hard all his life. He kept the discipline, the kind of military discipline over his life, and so forth. And here he is now in his late 60s or so, unable to meet the payments on his loan for the little trailer he lives in, unable to pay his own way, and unable to take care of himself economically. The world has changed, and yet he perceived a world that if you pay your dues, in a sense, if you go to work every day, if you are orderly in your life and so on, then you will thrive. You will do fine in America. And he's found out that that's not true. I mean, that story is a reflection, really, of the economic collapse of the 21st century, really, starting most emphatically in 2008, where people lost their jobs, but then suddenly realized they were marginalized. They were in a terrible plight. So, and I think a number of the stories do present a situation like that, and the response to it is violence or near violence, and you can see it in near violence incident in that story, Christmas Party, where the man Harold, whose wife has left him for a more successful man, and when he goes to the Christmas party they've invited him to, after several years after their divorce, after her abandonment, he comes very close to committing an act of violence with their adopted baby, their African baby they've adopted and treat as a kind of possession, and he comes very close to taking that away from them, and that's an act of violence too, because of the difference between what he perceived as a loving relation. If I love this woman and I marry her, and I buy her the chickens she wants and the animals she wants to take care of, and I'm loyal and faithful to her, then I'll have a good life with her. And of course, she falls romantically in love with this other man, and there's this huge gap between what this man expected, poor Harold expected, and what in fact he ended up getting.
Mostly dogs and cats and invisible parrots.
Yeah.
Why?
I guess we all live with animals, and maybe we don't acknowledge their presence enough in fiction. But even in the modern era, they certainly are present in fiction of previous centuries and early 20th century. But even in the modern era, most people live with an animal or two or three sometimes around them. And as it happens, during the writing of I had at the time 2 dogs, border collies who I love very much, and they come with me to work and to my office, my studio, and they're usually just sleeping around, during the day while I work. So they just ended up as part of the furniture of the story, in a sense. They were part of the life of the people, just as they're part of my life. Those two dogs also were old at the time, and they now have died since the stories were published. And I have another dog who follows me to work every day and lives with me and my wife. So they're very much a part of my life, I think, and I was raised that way. I grew up with animals around, and it just seemed as natural to include the animals as you would include children and friends and other human beings as well. Yeah, everybody has a few. Well, that's true. I like to think too that basically you're telling a story through images, and naturally they are, and they're most explicitly so in the title story. A permanent member of the family. The dog is clearly, and it says right out there, it says this is the dog in some way symbolized the continuity of family in spite of the divorce, and the fact that the dog went, followed him when he moved out of the house, and that the children came back and forth with the dog and so on. It's really the emblem of the marriage that he can keep alive and keep going, and hope that it in some way it denies the sad reality of the divorce. And of course when the act of killing the dog, accidentally killing the dog, that becomes very clearly an image or metaphor, if you will, for the breakup of the marriage, as well. And I think that they appear that way. The dog in the story Blue, that entraps a woman inside the used car lot, can be seen as a metaphor too, in many ways, for the kind of entrapment that African Americans particularly perhaps feel, trapped by the world, the society that they live in, and the viciousness of that, the violence of that. That dog Blue is terrifying, and so I think that they do operate very much like that throughout. They're not just there accidentally.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I'm trying, in a sense, to present these elements of contemporary life more or less as they're perceived by the characters that I'm writing about. They don't make a big deal out of it. It's, reality TV, the 6 o'clock news on television, and this sort of thing. The aspects of modern life that fill the lives of these characters are not there to be analyzed or to be satirized. I'm not a satirist anyhow by nature, and not there to be mocked either. They're there because they are the texture of people's lives, and I try to present them more or less as they're perceived by the people who live in those lives, whose lives I'm trying to dramatize. I'm aware that these stories might not make sense without footnotes if read 100 years from now, but I mean, I read stories that are set to, like, Gogol or Pushkin, or that are set in the past. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, set in the early 19th century, written in the early 19th century, often set even further back in time. And I don't have any problem understanding the elements that fill those characters' lives as well. So I don't worry too much about that. Well, perhaps, yeah. I didn't make that connection at the time, but yes. But I think Jack is a police officer, and I'm not. And so he probably has greater degree of detachment and suspicion than I have. I tend to approach people with a readiness a readiness for affection and respect for the people that I'm writing about, certainly, and so it's a slightly different degree of detachment, perhaps. I don't regard my characters with much suspicion.
Yeah, empathy, maybe.
Yeah. Yes, in fact, I leave to return to the U.S. tomorrow, Saturday, and the book is being published this week in the United States. Yes, it's called Voyager, Travel Writings, but it's a memoiristic account of travels over the years to places from West Africa to Nepal to the Andes Mountains to Scotland, the Seychelles Islands, etc. And some even in the United States, Alaska, and North Carolina. So it's an account of travels, but woven through it is a memoir, an account, accounts of memories and reflections upon, actually on my own history, romantic history, let's say, my own personal romantic history. So it's an unusual book. It's unusual for me, certainly, because I usually have avoided writing about myself. But I figure that at the age of 76, I guess I can go ahead and do it now. And